Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have another fantastic and incredible episode for you guys. So today we got 3 questions at least about AmFest and all the conflicts and battles that occurred at the TPUSA conference. We got one from KMAX, IPA enjoyer, and Gillis enjoyer. So a lot of enjoyers wanting to enjoy my answers on AmFest. So hey, I'll just ask for my general thoughts. For those who didn't pay attention, the conference was filled with everyone taking shots at each other, primarily between Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson, and speakers taking sides on that matter. With Ben Shapiro's speech was entirely against Tucker Carlson, and then Tucker Carlson's speech was primarily against Ben Shapiro, and then Bannon went off on Ben Shapiro, Megyn Kelly went off on Ben Shapiro. Other people tried to play mediators and saying that in the future, TPUSA conferences should have a debate between Tucker and Shapiro. From what I know, is Shapiro does not want to have a debate with Tucker for whatever reason. Shapiro is very hesitant to actually get in debates with certain people, from what I've been told and from what I know on the ground on these things. So that's it. So people were asking, what are my thoughts on that battle that we saw? The thoughts on AmFest in general. I didn't attend. I didn't really want to attend. I'm not speaking there. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to be like the old unk hanging out with these 22-year-olds. Maybe that could be good. But then it'd probably be like, the young guys coming up to me be like, oh my God, I've got a lot of questions for you. Or being mad that I'm not right-wing enough, or maybe I'm too right-wing. And then the few female women there are like, have no idea who I am. It's a very funny thing. I only autistic males seem to know who I am, but it's it's a burden we carry on. So 2 thoughts is just the general atmosphere of AmFest, which we'll go into, and then the battles that occurred there. One thing you have to realize is that the battles that were occurring is primarily something that we were noticing online, because I've been watching Fox News over the weekend, and Fox News portrayed it as this unifying event that was almost a type of religious revival, and it was all about Kirk, and it was also the debates that are happening on stage is just showing how much respect the right has for free expression and free discourse, unlike the left that suppresses all this. And that's how they portrayed it. Now, in the news media, they obviously covered, New York Times, Washington Post, those places covered it. They especially covered the Vivek speech, which we'll cover Vivek. We've got a question about Vivek later on. We'll cover from a pay-per-view, I believe. And so they covered that with his attacks on the heritage Americanism. I wrote an article yesterday about it, so I covered most of that in the column yesterday on the topic of Vivek and heritage Americanism. That got covered widely. So they were focused on this, but for the offline right, they portrayed it as a turn towards spirituality and a more religious mission for the right. It's very much similar to how they portrayed the Charlie Kirk Memorial as a type of religious revival that's occurring, that's a mix of religion and politics. And if you watch Fox News, and if you're the average boomer watching it, that would have been the depiction of it for TPUSA. Now, if you're reading CNN, you're getting a different picture. But if you're watching Fox, that's it. But that's how the average conservative in America gets their news. Still does. It's primarily through Fox and through these other outlets. And even a lot of the conservative media was hesitant to go into these battles. Some, they don't want to fully cover Tucker's speeches. It was very funny. Fox News really tried to beat around the bush from naming Tucker. And a lot of this stuff is like very inside baseball. Bannon's speech about Shapiro was primarily based on his experiences within Breitbart, that Ben Shapiro tried to take control over Breitbart, and Bannon fought against him for it and triumphed over him, which from what I remember back in 2015, 2016, that was true, because Shapiro was at times was a huge Breitbart personality, but then he began building up Daily Wire as his own thing because he wasn't having enough control over Breitbart. And I think he fully cut ties with Breitbart over the Milo alt-right article, which a lot of the stuff, some of the younger people are like, what the hell are you talking about? But the Milo alt-right article was like a huge deal. It was seen as an endorsement of the alt-right in early 2016, and conservatives flipped out about it. And I think it was either then or Breitbart defending the non-assault that Corey Lewandowski did of Michelle Fields, who Michelle Fields at the time was a Breitbart reporter, and Corey Lewandowski, who was Trump's campaign manager at the time, like slightly pushed her arm away when they were in a press scrum and Trump was moving forward, and he lightly shoved her arm, and it was like not an assault at all. And then they all claimed it was an assault, and she did something with her arm to show that there was bruises. This is like an insane time in conservative media, and I forget if it was either then where Breitbart didn't defend her, or it was the Milo thing. These happened all around the same time in early 2016. So anyway, that part was true, but the average person is like, why do I care about this? I have no earthly idea about this. Most of my audience who is going to care about this has no idea about this story. So all that stuff isn't going to carry over with ordinary people. But it was a sign that even though with Fox and offline right is trying to portray this as a unifying event, that it's extremely pro-Trump, that it's gearing up for J.D. Vance, that's a huge news story that Erica Kirk endorsed J.D. Vance for president in 2028, sending a message that the institutional right, or at least the institutional MAGA right, is going to rally behind Vance, and it's sending a message likely to Marco Rubio that you are not going to be inheriting this MAGA forces, is that this is all being prepared for Vance, not for you, and you're going to have to accept that deal where you'll be vice president or type of co-president rather than having to run on their own. I think is a very important move that she did this in 2025 rather than waiting till next year to do so. And I think it's mostly a message to Rubio, because people like Cruz, DeSantis, Hawley, all those people are going to run no matter what. But people from within the administration that depend on MAGA Trump world being behind them, they know that they're not going to have these resources and institutions on their side, that they're all going to advance. And I think it's meant to dissuade them from trying to run. Whether that works or not, we'll see. A lot can happen over the next year where people are going to be deciding whether to run for president or not. So that was big news. But outside of that, there's also an intense competition to determine who is leading conservative commentary. And Shapiro, he was the first one to make this declaration of war against the pro-Tucker side, and he was the one who did that. Now, it's probably bound that Tucker and Bannon were going to go after Shapiro and people like that. And they've been having this ongoing civil war since October. So it's not surprised that 2 months later they're still waging this, especially at a time when the right is fractious and divided and at each other's throats following Charlie Kirk's death. And there is, and Bannon made that clear that this is a fight over the machinery and institutions of the right. And they're waging it through TPUSA, which TPUSA is, trying to manage all these personalities, and maybe it's not going so well, but they're trying to. Now, I think most of the crowd went with Tucker and went with Bannon rather than Shapiro. Is that Shapiro, the one thing that's true is Megyn Kelly made this point, is that his subscriber base is going down, which is true. Shapiro is having fewer subscribers than Tucker and Candace. And Candace and Tucker, I'm critical of Candace, mostly pro-Tucker. He does go into a lot of silliness, but mostly pro-Tucker. And he generally represents our point of view. And he's getting much bigger. I really want to bring in the City Journal roundtable that they did interviewing Gen Z Republicans, because this will go into it, but I'll segue into that for the next segment because it's very important to what's happening at TPUSA and the future of the right. But in any case, what happened with there is that Tucker, Bannon, through War Room, Candace, Megyn Kelly are getting more viewers, creating more news than Shapiro. Now, Shapiro, I think, has more connections with the old institutions, with Republican politicians. Republican politicians are way more inclined to meet with Shapiro. Shapiro operates more on a tactical level. And I think if the average ordinary Republican was asked about their views, who better represents it, it's going to be Shapiro. This is for average Republican voter. I'm not saying this is Gen Z Republican or new entrant Republicans. I'm just saying the traditional Republican voter. More so than Tucker. I think, well, the UFO stuff, the pro-Venezuela stuff, a lot of them are not be that. But guess who are they more likely to tune in for? Tucker, because he's more entertaining. And the need for entertainment is something very important to the new state of the GOP. And who's more entertaining? Tucker or Shapiro? Shapiro or Bannon? Shapiro or Megyn Kelly? Shapiro or Candace Owens? Mark Levin are these people. These people are very boring. They're old. They're stale. They don't have that entertainment value. And entertainment value is extremely important for the level of right. Is that what is revealed in the City Journal? Somebody asked a question about this, is that they desire for politics to be entertaining, to be amusing. And I think that's something I've been going at for a long time. It's why the Insane Clown Party is so popular, because it's way more fun. Even for me, who shakes my head at it and finds it irritating, it's still very funny to have like these face tatted rappers to go out and do like a MAGA rap. It's very stupid, but it's at the same time, it's a level of entertainment. And a part of what Trump has done to the right is to bring in that entertainment value and make it a core part of the right. I think it's something that differentiates from the left. The left is trying to go more into the entertainment stuff. It's why Jasmine Crockett is running for Senate. I don't think Jasmine Crockett's going to win, but she gets a lot of popularity because she's entertaining. It's the same with AOC. It's well, Democrats all hate Fetterman, but Fetterman tries to bring that as well. Some of these Democrats try to bring that entertainment value in it. Newsom knows that. It's why he's going on all these podcasts, and he's hired these women to run his Twitter account to make it look like it's Trumpian. They know the entertainment value of politics, and that's something that Trump has transformed it. That he brought that reality TV edge, the need for that constant amusement into standard American politics. And Democrats are accommodating it, but not nearly as much. And it's not as much of a demand among Democrats as it is among Republicans now. I mean, even look at TPUSA. TPUSA looks like WWE. And there's fireworks and everywhere. And this is not a criticism. This is just how it is. It looks like a rock show. Nobody on the left is doing this. When they have their conferences, they're plain and simple. There's no pyrotechnics. There's no flashing lights. I don't think they have Nicki Minaj there. And that was their big reveal, is like, we've got Nicki Minaj here, which, some celebrity thing. And Fox News, of course, was all over it. But there's that element with it. So it's not surprising that there's this huge battle going on within the right for it, is that both sides, and I've been talking about this with the right civil war, is that they know that they are fighting for the future of the right. While Ben Shapiro has more control over influence over the formal institutions of the right, they were able to have a struggle session over Heritage Foundation to, force Kevin Roberts to push certain people out, to have him grovel before them. And then there's all these people leaving from Heritage. They still have a lot of influence over Republican politicians. Look at what's happening in Indiana, where these GOP, even though I don't think Shapiro really cared much about probably supported the redistricting, there's still these establishment figures and institutions that still hold a lot of sway over the right. And they're more inclined to listen to Ben Shapiro than they are to Tucker and other people. And so that's still there. But in terms of who Gen Z turns into, who the averaging Republican voter turns into if they're not plugged into Fox News. They are listening to Tucker. But you have to still remember is that far more people listen to Fox News than listen to the online sphere. And a lot of these things have to be kept in mind. And even the people who are listening into the online stuff aren't fully based in red pill. And we'll discuss that about the City Journal thing. I think the last thing to conclude on is J.D. Vance's speech, which this is supposed to be building up. This is supposed to be the final message of TPUSA. We've endorsed this guy for president. This is the future of the party, the future of the right that we want to present, and his message means a lot. Now, he'd made a great thing that I think is a strong point, is that you no longer have to apologize for being white. Great message. I think it's great to have our Vice President of the United States say that. And he's more likely to say that than pretty much any other Republican politician. So that's a big improvement. But he tries to bring everybody together. He subtly needled Shapiro's line about wanting to purge people. He had lines about, he gave a weird interview beforehand to Unheard where he went after heritage Americanism, but he's also like, well, it's not purely creedal. He's trying to walk a line and trying to present himself as this unifying figure of the right. And I think for the speech, he did about as good of a job as you can expect. He's trying to appeal to all different factions. He's throwing out red meat, like you no longer have to apologize for being white. He's saying we've always need to acknowledge we're a Christian nation. That went over really well with his with the audience, and a lot of other things that he said. And that's what it highlights. But I think the issue that's going to come up with Vance as being the successor to Trump is that entertainment factor. And this is something that has to be continuing to acknowledge about the future of right, is that it has to, to emphasize this point, it has to provide that level of charisma or somewhere close to it of Trump. Now, Vance is more charismatic than someone like DeSantis. And he's less weird than Hawley and Cruz. But he does not have that entertainment value of Trump. And a lot of the people who turned out for Trump did so because he was entertaining. It's why all these broadcaster audiences liked him, because they knew he's like entertaining, he's fun. There's that. There's a lot of why the ICP emerged to support Trump. I mean, it brought in both good and bad elements. Brought in the clownishness, but it also brought in people who would have not voted otherwise, and they voted for the GOP. And it's going to be a challenge for any hopeful successor to recreate that. And I think it's a reason, and it's also going to be hard for him to keep people together if he does not have that personality and charisma that Trump had. The speech was fine in terms of like standard politicians, it was delivered confidently. It wasn't as weird and awkward as some of his other speeches. He's better at giving interviews than he is on the stump, but he gave a decent enough speech. And it was supposed to be, the moment that everything at TPUSA was building up to and the final message. And that was the message. And it's like, I'm the leader, I'm the future leader of the party, but there's going to be these elements strongly opposing him. I think much of the online right is going to oppose him. Some of it's due to him not having the charisma level of Trump. Some of that is due that everyone's already turned on Trump for whatever reasons. Some of it's, political. They don't think they think of him as suspect due to him being never Trumper or married an Indian. They have those things. He's going to struggle with that, and he's also going to struggle with the establishment forces who don't like his connections to Tucker, don't like his views on foreign policy. They're going to run, that he's a crypto anti-Semite in 2028. I mean, it's what Ted Cruz is already preparing for. So he's going to have a lot of struggles. But I think it's the fact that the biggest news, I think it's not surprising that they're carrying on the civil war between Shapiro types and Tucker types in that. I think the biggest news is that TPUSA is going to back Vance and that they want to present Vance as the future leader of the party. And the fact that this was the whole theme of it seems to be getting the tacit support of Trump, which might be an indication that Trump may imply he wants Vance to be his successor, which could end the primary. If Trump just issues an endorsement of Vance, primary's over. He wins. No one else, Cruz and others are just not going to, succeed against that. I don't think he wants to do that. I think he wants to have a competition because like I said, he loves competition. He loved it through his reality TV show, to The Apprentice. He wants to have Presidential Apprentice. I don't think it'll go the way he expects, but he just wants competition. He doesn't just want it to be boring and everything lines behind Vance, but that might be the case if he feels that it's in his interest to do so. So it highlights everything that is going on with AmFest. I think the last point is what is the future of TPUSA? I think TPUSA is still going to be a major force in the next 4 years. They're promising to get involved in the 2026 elections. Their endorsement of Vance is going to matter a lot in 2028, especially the fact that there's still going to be a Charlie Kirk martyrdom view of this, and there's still going to be appeals to Charlie Kirk at that time, and this is who Charlie Kirk would have wanted. That's still going to matter a lot in 2028. But beyond that, it's unclear whether TPUSA can still thrive without Kirk. And I think that's seeing it in the article I wrote last week is, it's wrecked the right. But it's also had a leadership void with TPUSA, is that TPUSA is the most important conservative organization right now. No other organization matters as much as they do. But they don't have a clear leader. They have Erica Kirk, who's serving as that leader, and she's not Charlie. And I think that's why there's so much of this attacks on her and conspiracy theories around her, is because people they find it strange, some of the aspects about her, much more so than they did with Charlie. And she doesn't have the same skills that Charlie did. I mean, hardly anyone does. And then the other guys, they also don't have the skills of Charlie. So it's tough to have that central, an organization like that without the central figure. They're going to have to change and accommodate themselves without having Kirk, but it'll still be a very important organization for the rest of this administration and into the 2028 election. So then note, we're going to go into discussing, and it's a very similar note, on the City Journal round focus group. For those who don't know, Armed Day Enjoyer asked about this. For those who don't know, is that City Journal Manhattan, which is run by the Manhattan Institute, which is not isn't very pro online right. They did a new study, which I wrote an article about, claiming that the old guard Republicans are going to be the future, because they did the traditional Republican voters and saying that they're 2/3 of the party, and then they have the new entrant Republicans, which they're more critical of, that are more diverse, more populist, more pro-immigration, but also more racist. So it's a very confusing picture. And it did this point while saying that people like Ben Shapiro are the future of the party, not Tucker Carlson. And specifically, that entire article was obsessed with Nick Fuentes that they introduced the study to, and it was all about that. Well, they did a focus group on this line where they brought together 20 young Republicans from the Nashville area to discuss their thoughts on politics and other things. And it's an extremely revealing focus group. I recommend everyone reading it, because I think it shows the state of Gen Z Republican thought in its totality and what it actually is like in real life. And how many of these people are engaged with online right content, and they found a lot of these people. There was one guy who's like a full committed groyper, but he was the only ideologue of the group. These guys had cucky views on a lot of things, on immigration and things, but a lot of them were not pure ideologues. A lot of them had very bizarre beliefs. Like one guy said he used to like Matt Walsh as his favorite influencer. Now he wants Michelle Obama as president because he thinks she can bring the country together. And, you think he's like a Ted Cruz Republican. Other people were saying I find Hitler interesting and I like Nick Fuentes, we strong leader. And then they're like, I don't like that we're deporting so many people. It's very bizarre opinions. But this is how most voters are. Voters have very confusing politics. You'll meet like some strong evangelical Christian, but due to some personal issue in their life, they're pro-abortion, but they're still voting Republican. And then you'll meet someone who, might wear a mass deportation shirt, and they've got illegal immigrants in their family. There's voters are very weird. They don't fit very neatly into ideological boxes. It's why, when Manhattan Institute did that review of new entrant Republicans about how they're more open to conspiracy theories, populism, racist, anti-Semitic views, but at the same time, they're more diverse, far more diverse than traditional Republicans. Those weird pictures. And even of our own sphere, we're all talking about heritage Americans and, this quasi-white identity stuff. And then, we've got a lot of people who are not heritage Americans who are part of this stuff. So, and that's even the people who are very ideologically inclined, and not the people who are just casual consumers of this. And 19 out of 20 of these people were casual consumers of this content and reflect the views of Gen Z Republican voters. There's the one guy who was a full-on graper, but he was the only real ideologue. There wasn't even some of these people like Shapiro and other things. And there's that. So it revealed a interesting picture about him. And the most important thing that it found is that these guys don't approach politics very seriously, except for the one graper. Most of them view this as a form of entertainment and something they just casually observe. And they, unlike a lot of people on the online right sphere that have a very negative view of American life in the future, these people think that life is improving in America. Now, whether that's reflective of Gen Z Republicans itself or just that specific area, this is Nashville area, which is, a booming economy. If you moved there's not that much crime in Nashville compared to other cities, especially compared to Memphis and a lot of the rest of the South. It feels like a white yuppie utopia in Nashville. Red state utopia in a lot of ways when you're there. And it's harder to have a negative view of life when you're in Nashville. You think everything's on the up and up. People in other areas, I don't think they would have that same views. If they interview people from, upstate New York, I don't know if they would have that similar positive outlook. But in some ways, they think of themselves as having that their own lives are going to improve and things, which is very different from the online right, which use their own personal lives as not improving, even though they'll claim they're making six figures and they're getting all these hot women. It's usually not true. If it's, if you have very antisocial politics, that's not a reflection of your life going really well. I always quote this point from, there's an old interview from Slayer where they interviewed Jeff Hanneman, who was the primary songwriter of Slayer, and he's like, if you're listening to this stuff, there's something wrong in your life. Something's really gotta be wrong in your life. And I always think that that's the same with all right. Now, I don't mean that these people are all losers or something, but they, they're either formally ideologically committed that they think that something's fundamentally wrong in the country, or there's something wrong with their lives. I think that's why the online right is going crazy and not doing so well, is because they're struggling economically and personally, and then that is transferred to their political outlook. But that's not the case with the people here entered here. But the most important thing is they want entertainment from this, and they're mostly behind JD Vance, but it's not an extreme enthusiasm. It's just by default they're like, oh yeah, I guess JD Vance. It's not like a firm, I love JD Vance, I want him. Obviously, the Groiper is not a fan of JD Vance. He likes Bannon as the future of the party. Some of them offered some really bizarre. They're like, there's some influencer that I've never heard of as they offered it. And there's the one guy who said Michelle Obama. But, they have very interesting views where you couldn't put them in the box. So that's one thing. Second is that how the most popular influencer among them was Tucker. They did mention Shapiro. All the women mentioned like Brett Cooper and Allie Beth Stuckey. None of them mentioned Candace, but which might be a little bit surprising. I mean, Candace is Nashville based, but I suspect that a lot of Candace Owens' audience is a little bit older than, I think it's mostly millennial and Gen X housewives, not quite the young single women. Young single women, I think, are listening more to Allie Beth Stuckey and Brett Cooper and people like that, rather than Candace Owens. So that's something. But the number one influencer side is Tucker. So I'd expect these people would have very right-wing views. And then they asked them about Nick Fuentes, and about half the group knows who Nick Fuentes is. And only about 2 of them say he's a real problem. A lot of them are like, well, I don't like that he says things offensively, but I think he says a lot of right things, or I find him very entertaining and amusing. Of course, the Creeper thinks he's awesome. And then they say that. And then when they're even asked about Hitler, you surprisingly see even the one guy who's Jewish who has, very bizarre politics. I think it's the same guy who wanted Michelle Obama's next president, had nice things to say about Hitler. You're like, wow, this is an interesting development. And then they asked about immigration. And a lot of them were saying that they're deporting too many people. A lot of these are the same people who are saying, they think Hitler had interesting ideas and Tucker's their favorite influencer, and they find Nick Fuentes amusing, but maybe a little too offensive. And they say that. And even one of the more right-wing guys that they interview had a positive thing to say about H-1Bs. And so you see a weird picture with these guys that they're interviewed with. Now, you mentioned the one Hispanic girl who left. She at times showed a very right-wing disposition. She said she herself is very right-wing. But then when they started talking about her group of people about immigration, because a lot of these guys are complaining about, it's very moderate stuff. They're like, well, a lot of these people who come here, they speak Spanish, they don't speak English. And she got offended by that and she left. But this is somebody who describes herself as very, very right-wing, probably has an interest in some type of stuff like Nick Fuentes clips and other things, and gets her news primarily from TikTok, which, that's more likely inclined to have a lot of very right-wing content. So I think it's a very important thing, and I think it does show what the future of the GOP is going to look like. And it's a weird picture. And it's something that they go along with the City Journal thing, where the City Journal thing is like, oh, it's going to be traditional Republican voters with traditional Republican views. And only about 2 or 3 of these guys had views you could really line up as traditional Republican views. Maybe a little bit more. I mean, it's 20 people. You could say maybe 5 people. Well, 15 of them are either, it's hard to even classify them, or they're populist and they're into a lot of the online right content, but they don't, they think we're deporting too many people. And it's a very confusing picture, but it's going to be a very different Republican Party. And also some of their views, a lot of them are mentioning that they're devout Christians, but also a lot of them don't show the same level of interest in getting married and having kids immediately, which contrasts a lot of the image that we have of Zoomer conservatives, where they're all ready to have 15 kids starting at 20. Both men and women who are interviewed have skepticism about having so many kids and having a family. They complain about the dating market. They complain about the cost of raising so much children. They complain about healthcare costs. And they complain about the cost of affording a home. And so a lot of them seem much more open to populism than their elders. So it really, the focus group itself discredits Manhattan Institute study that they're saying, okay, the future lies with traditional Republican voters. Well, you went to Nashville, where you're most likely to pick up, traditional Republican voters, and you find a very different picture. You find that these people are more in line with those new entrant Republicans that they contrast with the traditional Republican voters, and their views are all over the place. But it also discounts some of the online right stuff, where they think that we're going to have a much more based and red-pilled right-wing party, and you can see this with the type of online content that they're consuming. Well, if a lot of these guys who are consuming the online right content and saying Tucker's their favorite, and they find Nick funny, and then they're thinking we're deporting too many people, and they'll defend H-1Bs and high-skilled immigration, and only one guy pretty much, and only the Groyper really said that they need to have a complete end to legal immigration. Now, if they said restricting legal immigration, that would have been a much more informative question to ask, and we would have interested to see. But even a lot of these guys are very like right wing, and went off on illegal immigration or maybe some of these other things. They then say like, well, it's good to have competitive immigration. So I found it very informative. The focus group had a lot to say about where the party's going and what the future conservatism looks like. And I don't think very many people. It really doesn't support anyone's preconceived notions. It's hard for anyone to take away from this and like, ha, my side is going to triumph. Unless your side is some type of vague, multiracial Christian, you have an element of Christianity into it, but it's not like really fervent because a lot of these people had moderate views on abortion as well. But it's Christian signaling, we'll put it that way. And vaguely populist, maybe that type of person would be happy with it. I think Bannon would probably be happy with some of the answers on this, but I think a lot of other people, whether you're a Ben Shapiro type, Tucker type, Graper, online right, you probably are not gonna like a lot of the answers from this focus group, but I think it's an accurate picture. It's important to interview the actual people who are going to be voting and finding out what they think rather than just relying on what's online, because online is not, it's very cliche to say, but it's not the real world. And it's something I always point out. So there is that. Somebody asked about Vivek. Oh yeah, pay-per-view did. So he had 2 questions. I think Gillis Enjoyer also had a second question. Yeah, we'll get back to him. K-Max had one. K-Max had a very simple one. I'll actually get to that. He said Dan Bongino announces resignation. Your prediction was that Dan Bongino would be the first to resign among Trump's high-profile appointments. I guess I did. He words this as a question, but I think it was. I don't quite remember. It's not surprising he's doing this. He's a guy who was like an ICP Rumblesphere dude who was like, oh, we're going to arrest everyone on the Epstein list. And now he's having to go to bat with saying, well, there's actually no Epstein list and stuff. And he knows he's ruining his post-administration career as an influencer and podcaster by staying there longer. And he's just kind of a clown. So he's leaving. And a lot of people want Cash and Bondi to leave. But if Cash and Bondi leave, they're going to have a hard time appointing loyalists to that position. And the reason why they're staying there is that they're, fully loyal to Trump, unlike others that they would have to put in that role. Is that Republican senators are not going to go along with appointing another even more committed loyalist. I don't even know who you could find that'd be more of a diehard loyalist than Cash and Bondi, even though they are clowns, but you have to rely on clowns if you want some of these things that Trump wants to do to be done. So I guess it was my prediction for first. I probably made that in the spring, but yeah, I guess I was right. So that's, I guess that's all the question that you have. So we'll go to pay-per-view. Pay-per-view asked, he says, as a fellow believer in polls, what do you make of Emerson's last week having Vivek trailing to Acton and how much his online battle is leaking to politics in the real world? This comes before his bad weekend at AmFest. I don't think it's having much of his online battle is not going to have an effect on the real world. I think it's just like a weird thing because he's becoming an online influencer. Most voters are like, what are you talking about? It's one thing for him to give the speech at TPUSA, but he's making this a main part of his campaign. If you watch his speeches on the campaign trail, he gives a similar spiel about America's about ideas, not ancestry. And it's like, why are you giving this speech? Like, voters are not tuned into the having debate. Unlike a lot of other people, if you look at the polling, the majority of Americans are on his side. And I had commenters like, well, they're scared of telling their truth. It's like, man, if you'd go and talk to average Americans, they're going to say this stuff. And you can even hear this when online right people have to go before a public audience where they're not talking to their own audience. And they go to a different audience and they're like, well, anyone could be an American, and but it's a culture thing. A lot of these public figures shy away from even making the racial and ancestry argument. So because they realize that there's public taboo around that. I don't really think that his online battles are so much it. The thing is that there's a perception that he is a kind of clownish candidate, a MAGA candidate, not that he is insufficiently based. It's that they think he's too right wing and too MAGA to represent Ohio, and I think that might be some of his problem. He is, whether we like it or not, the MAGA candidate. The Putsch guy is not going to be a serious challenger. He's running an entire campaign on X. He's anti-Trump. He's even more anti-Trump than Fishback, which we have a question about that. This guy's he's also even more clownish than Fishback. He's talking about how we need a special forces. He'll lead a special forces unit to go and take out all the people on Epstein list, and it'll be led by dads as well. He's not going to be a serious candidate. He's going to have dunks on. He's going to ratio Vivek on Twitter, and then he's going to get 5%. He's not going to. Well, he might get more if he's the only other person on the ballot, but he's not going to beat Vivek. They try to get an establishment person. They try to get Jim Tressel, who won a national title for Ohio State. He's got a lot of reputation and credibility in the state, and he was down by 60 points to Vivek. So that is what it is. Now, with the Democrat, the thing is, people are like, wow, he's down. I mean, most of the polls are showing him within a margin error or down by a few points. The thing you have to realize is that Vance and Moreno, both of whom won their races, struggled in the polling against their Democratic opponent. Moreno was down by 8 points in last summer against his Democratic opponent, against Sherrod Brown. He was struggling. He was not doing well. And everyone's like, we shouldn't have run with Moreno. He's going to get destroyed. Then he ended up winning. So it's too early to say that, oh yeah, he's done. He's never going to win. The fact is it's still a neck and neck race. It's not like she's ahead by 20 points and Vivek is down and it's because he's not being base enough and he's attacking heritage Americans. It's that he is demonstrating himself as too interested in being an online influencer, and they want he's running for governor, not even senator, and they want someone who's going to be a competent administrator and manager of the state, and he might struggle with that. Now, if the polling looks like this a month out from the election, then that's a real problem. But we'll have to wait till next year to see how it is. If he's still struggling in the polling, then yeah, that's the issue. And, Mike DeWine is resisting endorsing him so far. He's still wanting Vivek to show that he's serious, which means he's more along Mike DeWine. DeWine is not withholding his endorsement because of his attacks on heritage Americanism. It's that he views him as too MAGA and too much of an online influencer and too non-serious. So we'll have to see. I just think it's his own reputation is that he's viewed as a type of MAGA outsider, and I think Ohioans just would rather have a DeWine type. DeWine types suck. These are guys who would just want to have business first, don't want to do anything about immigration. They only care about working with Democrats to, do random shit in their own state. So that type of person would win easily. But Vivek could still win. I just want to point out that both Moreno and Vance struggled in the polls in races that they won. So, his second question is, why did he send 3? Okay, he sent an IQ supplement request, but a lot of people today, I always tell people try to go for one question for the main episode. And maybe 2 if you got really good ones, but we're getting a little greedy. It's going to be a hard 2-question rule for Wednesday because it's Christmas Eve. We're going to keep it a holly jolly Christmas Eve, and we're going to try to have a positive, optimistic, highly respected. So try to keep that in mind with the questions you're sending. Well, he has an IQ supplement. Actually, it's a request. He's on the rise of HR regime and its effect on culture. If there's a book on it, I'll probably do that. But his second question is, how should we on the right approach the discussion of billionaires? They're not the enemy. I think it's always kind of a sloppyism and lazy to just we just need to unite against the rich. I saw some stupid comment. I think it was coming from right wingers. Like, they want us divided so we don't go after the rich. And, I watched The Big Short last night. And it's once again a movie. It's like, the problem is the rich. And then they made us turn against immigrants and poor people. And Occupy Wall Street just united people to make a country work. It's stupid. Even with the financial crash, it pretends that the banks exploited immigrants and minorities because they're so greedy, and that's why we had an economic crash. No, the problem is the government, led by George W. Bush, pushed banks to give mortgages to minorities and immigrants despite their horrible credit rating and their inability to pay off their mortgage, to ensure that we had equal opportunity for all for home ownership. And the people not paying their mortgages weren't the greedy white people, which it always tries to make in this movie. It was the minorities and immigrants who were getting this shit, who shouldn't have gotten a mortgage in the first place. And I think a lot of our problems is just less so billionaires and more so a lot of the people making idiotic decisions. And then when things go wrong, then blame all the billionaires for it. A lot of billionaires aren't very good. I don't think Bill Gates is good. George Soros is obviously not good. But I don't think billionaires as a blanket class is a real issue. A lot of the terrible things they do is due to governments pushing them to do terrible things. Like they were censoring a lot to please Democrats and to please the government. They began heavily censoring when Democrats took over the House in 2018, and they were having all these hearings and testimonies and investigations into why they're allowing hate speech on the platform. So then they did this, and they're also pleasing European governments. And same thing happened with Biden. Now they're being more pro free speech in response to our own government. A lot of the billionaire stuff, it's just easy because it's based on envy and resentment. I don't think it's like we should worship them, but I don't think it's the billionaires are the real problem. A lot of it's based on our economic illiteracy and silly low-tier populism that makes no sense. And it leads you to have stupid conclusions about the financial crash where it imagines the good, noble people were paying their rent. The funny thing in this movie, there's a scene where he interviewed, they're talking to a Hispanic renter, and he's like, I pay all my rent, but you're saying the landlord isn't paying his mortgage? And that's not what was fucking happening. It's like that guy wasn't paying his mortgage and not taking care of the house either. So I know a lot of it's based on largely economic illiteracy. You shouldn't be in the total moment of just like worshiping them. I found the worship of Elon very cringe, but at the same time, this is it's like blaming banks and shit. I have no time for that tier of populism. I think it's very stupid, and it distracts us from the identity issues, and then imagines that this is all corporate driven. If we just tax the billionaire, and if we just adopt Bernie Sanders' agenda, that somehow we'll have a based in red pill state, which is just not the case. We're actually going to have a left-wing woke state if we go along with a lot of these policies. Nitro asked me to go off on James Fishback. I'm not going to go off on James Fishback, but explaining why I don't like him. He says what we want to hear. He's like, we're done with anti-white racism. He's like, I'm not apologizing for meeting with, grapers or whatever. And he's making a message about maybe Netanyahu, which I don't know. He's running for governor of Florida. But, the thing with Fishback is people will die on the hill that like, okay, exactly 2 years ago, he was promoting Barry Weiss and talking about how much anti-Semitism is a threat. Now he's running a gubernatorial campaign, one of the most Jewish states, where he's apologizing to the online right for saying anti-Semitism is a problem. And I just, this is just, he's running a president. I keep saying president. He's running a political campaign on X. He is not going to get any votes. He is, the real polls, he's at 2%. I know people in Florida that are normal people that aren't plugged in. They don't even know who Fishback is. And you would not know who Fishback is unless you're on Twitter. And most of the podcasts he's going on are not Florida specific. He's going on like all these other programs, but this is not what Florida voters pay attention to. He's doing events around the state, but he's getting some news attention. But I think the accurate thing is he's only at 2%. There are problems with Byron Donalds. I think that Byron Donalds should not be the guy. I think he would not win governor. I think he has more problems than even Vivek does, because I know he's not that talented of a politician. He's not very smart. He's not very good on the stump, and he's got potential scandals that could emerge, which could be very bad. And even though Florida's more red than Ohio, he could lose in the general election. Fishback can't win the primary, but even if he did, he would probably lose the general election by like 30 or 40 points. Like, no one would vote for Fishback. And there's just like a scam artist vibe around him. The fact that he completely switches and he's using this as a launch pad to become an influencer, likely to promote like his sketchy business opportunities. There is the fact that his previous employer sued him and that he misrepresented himself. There's all these claims that he's in massive debt. He's got a lot of legal and financial problems. There's also the fact that the way he talks, he's better than a lot of other politicians in the way he talks, because he just, goes with the flow. But he sounds like an AI chatbot. And he talks like, it doesn't sound very authentic. It sounds very artificial and, like a scam call I just received. And, I just don't trust the guy. I think that this guy is kind of as a con artist vibe to him. Now, a lot of politicians have that vibe, but it's very clear what he is. And, he says the right things, but he's not going to compete in an election. The way, you can't run a serious campaign through X, which a lot of our people, due to the fact that they escape from reality and go on to social media, they think that this guy is going to win. It reminds me of all these alt-right guys who thought that, Paul Nehlen was going to win. And Paul Nehlen was on Gab posting like severed rabbi heads and shit. And I'm like, man, this is... I don't think this is a major concern to his voters. And the fact that he's like banned from Twitter and having to run his whole campaign through Gab, and then he got banned from Gab, I think people stopped believing he was going to win his race after he got banned from Gab. There's still that element. I think you're going to see more of these X-based candidates running forward, because it's a way to make yourself an influencer. And it's a way, it opens up economic opportunities for you. You can begin selling stuff. You can make a name for yourself. You can run a popular podcast. And if you just run for office, and it establishes a level of credibility, it doesn't matter if you only get 1% of the primary. You can say, I ran for office and now I'm an influencer. And I think it's just Fishback using this as an opportunity to create more business opportunities for himself and turn himself into an influencer. I don't think he is a serious candidate. I don't want to pretend he is a serious candidate. I don't like that I'm forced to have all these clowns to like, oh, this guy's really going to win. He's not. But I mean, there is an amusing element to him. It is very funny. He has to apologize to, online right anons, not even to voters, for praising Barry Weiss. It's there is an amusing element to it. So it is like good content, but I don't want to pretend that he's a serious candidate. And that's my main issue with him. And I think it's a problem if people are like, well, we're going to be the future of the party. We're going to have some serious candidates. And then you have like this, these scam artists who are running social media based campaigns that have no chance of winning. And then they lose, and people will just buy lies. And Fishback knows he can just lie, because he's criticizing all the other polls. He ran one internal poll that I don't even know what pollster did that showed him well ahead. But the fact that most Floridians don't know who he is, while they do know who Byron Donalds is, skepticism. Now it just all says like, oh, these polls completely bullshit. They only show me at 2%. I don't. I just really have no time for bullshitters, and we have enough con artists in our sphere. We don't need another one. But there is an entertaining value to it, and as I said, one of the most important factors for right-wing politics now is the entertainment value, especially with younger Republicans. And Fishback does provide that, but he's not going to go anywhere. I guess the lieutenant governor who probably sucks and is a DeSantoid, but he can actually win, and he'll probably be relatively pro-Trump. Whatever, he's fine. And Collins is his name, but I don't have any thoughts. Strong opinions about the Florida race. Both Byron Donalds and Fishback are clowns in different respects. So, New England Refugee has a question. He says it has become very vogue to shit on Churchill among the online right. I think he forgot some words. I think he said, I like Churchill and believe he did the best he could under the circumstances. What are your thoughts? Churchill's a complex figure. And that's a topic for an IQ supplement. Actually, I'm just going to say that. We're already near an hour. Churchill, I think, is more complicated. I think as making him as the villain of World War II, there's a much better villain to make of World War II if you're trying to undermine the mythology around it. And that's Stalin. I think as Churchill, it's weirder in the circumstances we have. I think making him out to be Stalin as a villain is much more productive. But on a full opinion of Churchill, Churchill wanted to keep Britain white. Not bad domestically, politics. And I think it's his role in getting Britain involved in World War II is overstated. Is that once Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, opinion turned dramatically against Germany and was prepared for war. And Churchill wasn't even in the cabinet at the time. It did save his political career, as he was about to lose his seat, and then they annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia, and then he was kept in power, and then was able to enter the cabinet under Chamberlain. But Chamberlain was the one who brought them to war over Poland, because they basically said that this is a red line. We're not going to keep it, because they felt that Hitler wouldn't keep his word. And the rest is literally history. But we'll do an IQ supplement on Churchill for fuller thoughts. But in my opinion, I think he's a much more complicated figure. I don't view him as the villain of World War II. You can look to Stalin if you want a revisionist take on that. For that makes a lot more sense, and it overstates his individual role in getting him into war. It's imagining that all of Britain wanted peace, but then Churchill tricked them into wanting war. That's not really how it happened. Let's go with James. James has 2 questions. He says, they're all about... I actually have a lot of James Savage on the Compact article. Deuteronormative. We have a lot of questions today. So I'm going to go quickly through that. He said, "Why?" We'll go with Deuteronormative first, and then we'll go to James, who asked a similar. He said, "Why are so many people acting like anything in the Jacob Savage article, which highlighted anti-white discrimination in the media sphere, is new information? I find it hard to believe even liberals didn't understand they've been discriminating against white men, especially since they often celebrate openly." I think it's just never fully illustrated for people, and the fact that it seems to come from a mainstreamish source or a guy who's a liberal makes it novel, and I think he outlines it in a way that's very comprehensive and very compelling that made people want to read it. You don't really see these type of pieces in Washington Post or New York Times, so it makes it very informative to people. And I think a lot of people who haven't really thought about or dwelt on it, they are open about this, but a lot of people don't really think about this stuff, and this forced them to think about it. Became from an unlikely source, and a source that is more likely to persuade them. I think it's just that it's all in one place and written in a compelling manner, and it also has these anecdotes of these guys personally experiencing it that makes it such a persuasive piece. And James asked, all his questions are about Pedro Gonzalez, who said, he jokes he's about my favorite pundit. He says that no one on the new right could have written a feature like Savage, so they criticize it for not being a racist, misogynist creed. There's no one in the movement who could have written a feature like this, essentially treating it like it's worthy of the Pulitzer. He seems to be using it as a club against right-wing anons over the head who are his real targets. Since you also critique the online right about being off the deep end, are you two seeing eye to eye on this topic? No. Or is he just using anything and everything he can to launch missiles at us in general? Yes, he is. He's one of these people that where anti-Trumpism and anti-rightism has become his only lodestar, and he has no real politics or principles at that. He will be pro-tariff. He'll be anti-tariff, depending on what makes sense. He'll be pro-immigration, anti-immigration, depending on what is. He'll be pro-deportations, anti-deportations. Whatever gives him grounds to critique Trump, he will go with. It's even the same with abortion. Maybe he'll think that they're being cruel in abortion if that's the best way to attack Trump. And then he'll say he's, more pro-life than pro-Trump. Anything and everything, he has no principles. It is just pure resentment and pettiness and criticism. And when anti-Trump and anti-online right are his only lodestars, there's no principles behind it. And a lot of guys get into this because they get, butt hurt over attacks or they feel cast out. And this is all that Pedro writes about. Pedro has, he's a very shallow person, not very smart person. He's trying to become a culture person, but his culture takes are jokes. This is... he's like, I'm a literary person, and he makes himself out to be. He's not. His literature is a joke, and his political, just like his political analysis was a joke. But it just becomes all purpose. There's no principles to it. Being able to critique the online right for its insanity, it has to be principles based. It has to be more than just simply disliking them because they made fun of you or you have this personal grudge against them. You have to be on principles. He wants the Republican Party destroyed just because he wants all these people he has personal animus towards to be ruined. And then Pedro will be seen as the greatest writer of our time. The next Hemingway. It's not going to happen. I don't think the point is that no one on the new right could have written a feature like Savage. It's that it would have never been as popular because most of our writing is geared towards our own audience, and you have to check all these boxes because a lot of our writing that people want is like a Maoist struggle session or just telling people what they want to hear. And if you ever write anything interesting or outside the box, people just flip out and get mad. The weird criticism I get from one of my articles is just stupid. I get a lot. If you ever write outside the box. It was easier for him to make this article because he's liberal. I think if it came from the right, it'd been too suffused with a lot of our preaching to the converted and material just for the converted rather than trying to talk to the unconverted. But I don't think... Pedro is not a good faith commentator, so I would not care about what he has to say at all. And the second question, now that Pedro is using words like racist, misogynist, and thinking tin walls could win over young men for being a football coach and the brat from campaigns, Kamala could work, is he trying to find a way to back from left where he came? He was never from the left. This is one of the lies about Pedro, is that he was not a Bernie bro. He was a Ted Cruz supporter. He made up that he was a Bernie bro because he realized that being a former leftist has more cachet with the right than being a former Cruz supporter. So he made up that he was a Bernie bro. He was a Ted Cruz guy. He was just a standard conservative in the past. And he was writing for conservative Tea Party publications back then. He was never part of the left. The left doesn't want him because he doesn't have any talent. He's not entertaining. He's not interesting. He's not funny. They have no interest in him. And I'm not quite sure who reads him because, being an all-purpose anti-Trump person, if you're coming from maybe the far right or from the center, if you're wanting the Republican Party to be more like its old version, or you're wanting a more radical right version, that you can find a clear audience. But just veering from both positions of it's not insufficiently radical and it's insufficiently moderate, or it should be more liberal, and then talking about how normal Americans think this, but then normal Americans want a more radical party. There's that type of schizophrenic positioning has no real basis. And the left doesn't want him. The left made fun of him and opposed him when he got published in a respectable literary journal. And a lot of leftists got mad about it. Now he's still trying to suck up these people, but they're ignoring him, which is really funny. One thing, he's kind of like an incompetent Indian, is that he sucks up to people he thinks ahead of him or above him, while he talks down and has contempt for people he believes below him. And, it's like Indians. They're either talking down to you or sucking up to you. That's like with Pedro, but Pedro is a lot dumber and can't control his emotions and is a lot angrier. And that's why he didn't succeed where Indians succeeded. So that's my thoughts on that. Luke asks, you spoke about dual citizenship and hypothetically fleeing America. If tomorrow America became a liberal dictatorship, where would you go? I don't really have a place to go. There's no real good place to go. That's like the problem with the thing. Like, I would just have to stay in America. I mean, if 2028 comes around and maybe Europe's better, maybe if Argentina becomes a more solid right wing place, or Chile, you might want to go there. But even I know people go to South America and they're like, it sucks. Like, you really have a declining quality of life. You'll get robbed and there'll be no police to like help you out. I mean, like, you're going to be suffering a declining quality of life. I think a real problem is that if you do have that citizenship and you do have that connection to another country, like Italy, Poland, or something, it makes sense to go there. But for a lot of people like me, Heritage American, we have nowhere to go. This is our only country, and your best bet will probably be America, depending on the circumstances. But for other people who have options, an option is not Israel. I don't have a problem with that. But I don't have a good option to flee to. But things could change by 2028. Tiberian fan asks where I get my news from. Mostly social media, but I have to go through it. Somebody said, subscribing to 80 different Telegram channels. Please don't follow Telegram. I go to Drudge Report. I'd read Drudge Report 2 times a day. I think it's very anti-Trump, and it's always trying to make like the world's about to collapse. But you get a good set of headlines that you're not going to get from like CNN and going to MSN front page. You're going to get a good diversity of opinions, and that's something that transcends what you're seeing on Twitter. It's worthwhile to go and check on a mainstream news publication, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, to see what they're talking about. You just have to really keep up with a lot of different sources. But I always make sure to check Drudge Report. It does give you a good idea of what's going on in the world, even though it wants to make like the world's about to collapse and it's very anti-Trump. But it does give you a different perspective of what you see on Twitter, as well as checking on Wall Street Journal and New York Times. But like everyone else, I still use Twitter. It's not as good as it used to be, but you still don't have a lot of other options. Sharecrop asks, does some of the opposition among white people to mass deportations arise from a subconscious fear that would reduce their personal quality of life beyond practical concerns like labor shortages, to include the loss of convenient service roles filled by minorities? Yeah, I think that's it. I think it's also just kind of a moral thing where they're like, oh, this person's been here for 20 years and they haven't hurt anybody. This is so awful. People really don't have the stomach for the type of things that we want. And it is like one of the funny things is like even people who complain that we're not doing enough mass deportations will then say we need to do this more humanely. Yeah, you're going to humanely deport 100 million people. Get fucking real. Like all these people, it's like everyone has like fantasy, compare real life to fantasy. Thus they just imagine that. But the fact that like people don't have the stomach for it is even reflected on our own side, which thinks that they're intentionally doing these terror tactics to turn against the public. No, this is how you do mass deportations. This is how you convince people to deport themselves and to not come here. You have to have the terror tactics. The terror. If we were just doing things like, what if they just arrested these business owners and then all the migrants would flee? No, that wouldn't happen. We've tried to do that several times in American history. It didn't fucking work. What works is terror tactics. With Operation Wetback and now with the Trump administration, we are seeing a significant decline in the foreign-born population. You have to do the terror tactics. So I always support it, but the public doesn't have the stomach for it. And that's just one thing you have to deal with. But you just have to say, fuck the public and do this. A lot of times I say you have to care about the public, with terrorists, economy, a lot of other things you do have to worry about, because if they're losing their jobs, they're not going to vote for you. And, if the economy's sucking, that's going to be a lot of other problems. But with immigration, you have to do what's necessary for the future of our country. And what they're doing is necessary. But a lot of people it's both a personal quality of life that they can't get someone to come clean their house, they can't get someone to mow their lawn. That does make people upset, and they do, if they watch like TikTok and they see these clips, it makes them like, that's inhumane, that's un-American. But you just have to say, we don't care, we're going to do this anyway. Second, would greater awareness among average, less politically engaged people of current demographic shifts compared to historically low minority populations alter the views of immigration and related policies? I think if they realize how few white people there are, they get uncomfortable with that and they might change their views. There's this great viral clip. It's like some man on the street and he's asking how many people in the world are white. And then they learn it's like, I should know this off the top of my head, but it's like 6%. It's under 10%. And then there's like this really uncomfortable sinking feeling of how they're a global minority and they're not the majority of the population, of the world population. And that makes them, weirds them out. They get very uncomfortable with that. I think if they realize how few white people there are and what that would mean for their country, it would create a greater support for immigration restriction and wanting to keep America whiter than it will be if we have open borders. So I think people just aren't aware of it. They're not aware of the population, of how many white people there are in the world. I think letting them know that whites are a very small global minority and we're being overrun in our own countries, I think that will lead to attitude changes. Max Zoid asked about Nashville hot as a flavor option everywhere. What are your thoughts on this culinary export from your home state? I don't even remember it growing up. To be honest, I don't really, it's like not like, oh, I'm going to get my Nashville hot chicken sandwich. That's I guess it was something there, but it was something I didn't grow up with. I think that's the case with a lot of Southerners who grew up in the suburbs. Like, our culinary options are Chili's, not really the local stuff. It's something overstated, but I don't really care about the Nashville hot. I'm a white person, so I don't really like hot food that much. So I'm a very basic white person, so I don't really eat it. But people's obsession with it, it's whatever. I don't really think much about it. I don't really have much thoughts on it, except to say that it wasn't that big when I was growing up in Nashville. Gillis Enjoyer's second question: what are your thoughts on the phrase "gay race communism"? Do you think it's the best term to describe the ideology we're up against, or do you think it'll ever catch on, or is it too online? I mean, it is effectively online. It's whatever. I'd have to. I do have some issues with it, maybe, but it's an online term. It's whatever. We really are just against libtardism and wokeism, but if you want to call it gay race communism, whatever. I guess it people online like it. It's not going to translate offline, but I don't know. It describes a problem more than saying like neoliberalism or third worldism. So that's my thoughts on that. We now conclude with L.K. Rurik. He said, I rewatched Elf for the first time in years, and though I usually don't like Will Ferrell movies, I thought it held up decently, like a solid 6 out of 10. Why do you hate it so much? Dude, I hate it. I find Will Ferrell annoying. I liked Will Ferrell as a kid, but I just can't handle it. It's there is something annoying, obnoxious about it that I really don't like. You know, it's not like Home Alone or the Christmas Vacation movies. Like, generally, those are probably my favorite. It's Wonderful Life. I like the George C. Scott, Christmas Carol. I've seen A Christmas Story way too many times in my life to ever want to watch it again, but it's okay. I think if I had only watched it a few times, I'd say it's a good movie, but I've seen that way too many times in my life to ever want to watch it again. Elf, I just find it as an annoying, obnoxious movie. You know, he's like, there's a lot of socially awkward interactions. I never like watching those in films. I find Will Ferrell very annoying, and no, I just don't like it as a film. Sorry, everyone is allowed to have different tastes, but I do not like Elf. So I will stick by that position no matter what anyone else says. So that is it for Highly Respected today. We're going to be back with more great content this week. As a reminder, we have some machine going off in the background. I think it's some, I'm recording in a different place. I think it's the air conditioning. So my apologies on that. I know people are going to be complaining. They complain about any noise that happens. You know, it's like sirens and stuff. It's like I had the power to tell like ambulances to not drive around when I'm recording. I don't have that power to do so. I wish I did. But we're going to have great content this week. Probably not going to have another article on Tuesday. I do have an AmCon article. I don't know if it's coming out today or tomorrow, so I'll just repost that on Substack. We will have our Christmas Eve mailbag reminder. Ask good questions. We're going to keep them to 2. Do not send 3. Well, you can consider sending 3 for New Year's Eve for our end of year mailbag on December 31st. We'll have that. Obviously taking Thursday off for Christmas, and then we'll be back with an IQ supplement on Friday. So be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.